The depths of the human soul know no bounds. Some people have already committed unimaginable atrocities that are difficult to put into words. From bloodthirsty serial killers to self-proclaimed angels of death to necrophilic cannibals, here are some evil criminals that will send chills down our spines. But before we get started, be sure to hit the like button and ring the notification bell for more videos. Also, stick around until the end to learn about one of the most terrible people to have ever lived. John Wayne Gacy. For me, they weren't human. Even this short sentence that John Gacy said about his victims allows a deep look into the pitch-black mental life of the 33 times murderer. Because Gacy often appeared at street parties in a homemade clown costume, he became known in the media as a killer clown. His countless victims were boys and young men whom he lured into his home, sexually abused, and then strangled or killed, often under pretense. Although the gruesome series of murders began in 1972, it wasn't until 1978 that investigators finally caught the killer. The last victim, 15-year-old Robert Piest, said shortly before he disappeared that he had met Gacy. The subsequent house search and the later confession then revealed the bloodthirsty machinations of the killer clown. He admitted to murdering 33 people between the ages of 14 and 21. Gacy buried 28 bodies under his home in Des Plaines and said he threw the other 5 into a river. Not all of his victims have yet been identified, and investigators suspect that the number of unreported murders is significantly higher. After his arrest, the killer showed no signs of remorse. His only mistake was operating a cemetery without a license. Gacy was sentenced to 21 life sentences and 12 death sentences, a sentence that would earn him a sad entry in the Guinness Book of World Records. Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Albert DeSalvo. Unbelievable but true. When Albert DeSalvo confessed to strangling 13 women in 1965, he wasn't charged. The evidence was simply too scarce. Instead, the Boston Strangler would go to jail for a series of rapes. However, it wasn't until 2013 that it was discovered that the Massachusetts man had not lied about his murder confessions. A DNA comparison confirmed that DeSalvo really was the Boston Strangler, who ambushed single women and strangled them with clothing. At that point, the perpetrator was long gone. He had been stabbed to death by a fellow inmate in 1973. Mark Chopper Reed. Actually, I didn't kill that many people, probably 4 or 7, depending on how you look at it. Anyone who loses track of their own crimes must have a lot on their plate. Between the ages of 20 and 38, the Australian Mark Brandon Reed spent just 13 months in freedom. It was clear early on that Chopper would by no means pursue a normal career. As a member of a street gang, he was already involved in countless fights as a teenager, and he amputated the toes of some of his victims in order to break them mentally. Countless jail terms, electroshock therapy, and a dubious career in the limelight followed. Accordingly, Reed completed several TV appearances, went on the I'm Innocent tour, and wrote some crime novels. The Australian was diagnosed with liver cancer in 2012 and died around a year and a half later at the age of 58. Jeffrey Dahmer. After his arrest in July 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer confessed to killing 17 people. While killing his victims, most of whom were young men from Milwaukee's gay community, he used the same pattern. First, he lured his unsuspecting counterpart into his apartment, where he mixed a narcotic in his drink. He then sexually assaulted the unconscious victim before strangling him. As if these acts weren't terrifying enough, he then abused the corpses and documented their dismemberment with his camera. In many cases, he picked up parts of his victims, such as their heads, and ate some of their body parts. Despite the fact that the serial killer was found to have many mental disorders, the grand jury found his sanity proven. Dahmer received 16 life sentences and was killed by a fellow inmate on November 28, 1994. In the final months of his life, Jeffrey did his best to atone for his actions and become a better person. He was so dedicated to this idea that he even began attending church services regularly and decided to become baptized into the Church of Christ. According to those who knew him, Jeffrey's turnaround appeared to be genuine, and it's incredibly possible that Jeffrey had truly learned from his mistakes and tried to begin his life anew, only for it to be taken by a fellow inmate a short while later. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez's criminal history is as long as it is terrifying. His criminal record is full of despicable acts such as murder, rape, burglary, kidnapping, and child abuse. Born on February 28, 1960 in El Paso, Texas, he killed 9-year-old Mei Lung in 1984, but it wasn't until 2009 that his first murder was proven. What followed were many more attacks on women and older men, which often ended fatally. Between 1984 and 1985, the so-called Night Stalker killed at least 13 people, sexually abusing 11 of his victims. In doing so, the murderer seemed to have discovered a kind of Satanism. In one instance, he painted inverted pentagrams on the walls of a slain woman's home. He also cut out both eyes from a corpse that were never to be found. In August 1985, after descriptions of a man with curly hair, bulging eyes, and bad teeth had been circulating, officials finally made the breakthrough. Shortly before, Ramirez had shot a man in the head and raped his fiancée. However, since the two survived the attack, they were later able to provide a detailed description of the perpetrator. The killer was also spotted trying to break into a house. The unnoticed observer managed to write down part of Ramirez's license plate number. Investigators later secured fingerprints in the parked car, which could be assigned to Ramirez. As a result of the nationwide manhunt, a group of young men became aware of the fugitive. Had the police not arrived in time, the killer would have been beaten to death. On September 20th, 1989, after a seemingly never-ending trial, which is among the most complicated in American judicial history, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to 19 deaths in the gas chamber. However, the sentence was never to be carried out. Ramirez managed to get a reprieve for 28 years, dying of liver failure on June 7, 2013. Donald Harvey. How many people did paramedic Donald Harvey really kill? According to his own statements, there were 87, while the official estimate is 57 at most. Regarding his countless victims, Harvey stated that he acted not out of cruelty but out of compassion. Accordingly, the self-proclaimed Angel of Death only committed the murders to relieve the incurably ill from their torments. Over a 17-year period, the paramedic used a variety of killing methods, including the administration of cyanide, arsenic, and asphyxiation. The killer secretly mixed the deadly substances into the food and injections of his patients. However, the Angel of Death not only killed in the hospital, his partner, his father, and 2 neighbors were also victims of poison attacks. Harvey received 28 life sentences, but was found beaten up in his cell in March 2017. He succumbed to his injuries a few days later. Alexander Pitsushkin. Russian Alexander Pitsushkin dreamed of killing 64 people, an unimaginably high number, which corresponds to the number of squares on a chessboard. Ultimately, however, only 48 murders could be proven. However, according to Alexander, since it would have been unfair to forget his other victims, he stressed that he killed a total of 61 people. For his atrocities, the Russian went to Moscow's Bitsa Park, where after dark he lured his victims into remote corners, got them drunk, and usually killed them with a hammer. Those killed were mostly vulnerable and defenseless people whom the chessboard killer thought no one would be looking for. The motive that emerged was a combination of craving for recognition and lust for murder. Accordingly, during his actions, he felt like a godlike judge who decided on life and death. Pietruszkin was sentenced to life imprisonment in 2007. When asked what he would have done if he had managed to kill 64 people, he replied, "Then I would have bought a new chessboard." Jayant Patel. Jayant Patel was a surgeon who was charged with gross negligence after working for a hospital in Australia, possibly causing the deaths of at least 13 people. In 2010, he was arrested on 3 manslaughter charges, as well as 1 charge for severe bodily harm. From here, his court proceedings grew messy, and he was awarded 2 separate retrials before ultimately being convicted of simple fraud. Patel's poor work was noted by many staff members of the hospitals he'd worked for. Nurses reported hiding their patients from him simply so that he would not be the one to perform their procedures. He was regarded as sloppy, inadequate, and showed poor hygiene, with some going as far to mockingly call him Dr. Death. He is believed to have altered countless medical records and even forged death certificates to cover his poor work. Overall, Patel was linked to at least 87 deaths, with 30 of these patients dying while under his immediate care. After several mix-ups, 2 retrials and multiple appeals, all charges, aside from fraud, were ultimately dropped. Patel made it out with no jail time and was only forced to give up his medical license. Pedro Rodrigues FILHO. One would think that a killer's series of murders would come to an end with his arrest. Not so in the case of Brazilian Pedro Rodrigues FILHO. During his time in prison, he killed 47 fellow inmates. Pedro had already committed his first murder at the age of 14 when he killed the deputy mayor of Alfenas. The motive he gave was that he had treated his father badly, but later he also joined the list of his victims after he had murdered Pedro's mother with a machete. Officially, the Brazilian killed 70 people, but according to his own statements, it was well over 100. Although the serial killer received a 128-year prison sentence, he was released early on April 24, 2007. In September 2011, he was jailed again, this time for false imprisonment. However, Pedro is currently free again. He was allowed to leave prison again on December 10, 2018 because of good behavior. In his Brazilian homeland, the multiple murderer is now a real celebrity. In social networks, he campaigns against gang crime and explains the dark side of crime. Brian Draper and TOREY ADAMCIK. We would like to introduce you to 2 of the most unbelievable murderers the world has ever seen. The then 16-year-olds Brian Draper and TOREY ADAMCIK. On September 22, 2006, the teenagers stabbed their classmate, Cassie Jo Stoddard, who had been babysitting her aunt's house at the time. The killers had previously watched a film with Cassie and her boyfriend before saying goodbye on the pretext of wanting to go to the cinema. Later, when Cassie was alone again, they entered the house through the basement, disguised in horror masks, and killed the youngster with countless stab wounds. This case seems all the sadder when we consider that Cassie fell victim to what is probably the greatest idiot the earth has ever seen. So, Brian and TOREY thought it would be a good idea to document their devious plans on camera. The moments after the crime, in which the teenagers euphorically confessed to the murder, was also captured in the picture. If Brian and TOREY had their way, they would have killed many more people. However, since the 2 got caught up in hair-raising contradictions during the interrogations and didn't even manage to destroy the videotape, they've been serving a life sentence since August 21, 2007, with no prospect of parole. Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman was a British doctor and serial killer who's known to have taken the lives of at least 215 of his patients. His actions have been the cause of worldwide discussion regarding the responsibility and power of medical professionals and have raised concerns about how accurate certain types of treatment may be. Shipman's issues first began back in 1975, just 5 years after receiving his degree in medical licensing. It was discovered that he had been writing false prescriptions for opiate pain medication and had become addicted. He was forced out of his job and into rehab for the next 2 years. In 1998, one of Shipman's patients, an 81-year-old woman, suddenly passed away after being visited by him. Her family found this odd, as she was in perfect health prior to his visit. In addition to this, Shipman insisted that no autopsy was necessary and attributed her death to natural causes. By 2002, police had launched an investigation into Shipman and found that a similar scenario had played out over 215 times, with Shipman's patients unexpectedly passing away after a visit from him. It was soon discovered that Shipman had been dosing his patients with lethal amounts of painkillers, though his motive was never revealed. He was soon sentenced to life in prison. Take a look at a short interview that took place just before his sentencing. So folks, and now it's your turn. What do you think of the felons we just introduced you to? Do you know similarly frightening cases that didn't make it in today's video? We look forward to your comments. Leave us a subscription and a like if you want to learn more about the frightening abysses of the human soul. Thanks for watching. Take care and see you next time.